It is my great pleasure to introduce today's opening keynote speaker, the president of Johns Hopkins University, Ron Daniels. He's a great friend of the foundation, a great friend of Greece. He's been always willing to help us with everything that we have reached out to him. His intellectual capacity is impressive, and in some of the greatest initiatives and more complicated ones that the foundation has undertaken, he has always been willing to spend a lot of personal time talking with us about what we should do, what we can do, and how he can help. He will be speaking today about Baltimore's promise, making sure that the April crisis doesn't go to waste. Thank you.
Good morning. 2 months ago tomorrow, following a week of peaceful protests that were motivated by the tragic death in police custody of a 25-year-old African-American man named Freddie Gray, parts of my adopted city, Baltimore, erupted in protest and in violence. The world watched as cable news channels ran a seemingly endless loop of images, kids rebelling in our streets, looters ransacking our stores, and phalanxes of police moving in military formation towards civilian crowds. Networks airdropped their anchors into Baltimore to report live as the uneasy tension of the street protests grew ever more precarious. It became a national and international story because it played on strains that have been growing in cities across the United States, fed by racial injustices and fierce disparities in educational opportunities and economic prospects. In truth, the protests weren't just about one tragic death or one hurting neighborhood. Rather, it was in a moment that unearthed deep-seated truths and laid them bare, calling out the inequities that plague our city in persistent and painful ways. Baltimore, as many of you well know, has long served as an allegorical tale for America's century-old failure to redress fully its founding flaw of slavery. Whether we like it or not, our identity as a Rust Belt city riven by concentrated and persistent African-American poverty is seared in the nation's psyche. Try as we might to keep the conversation focused on our burgeoning arts and cultural scene, our landmark inner harbor, our leading educational and medical institutions, the story invariably turns to less flattering themes and images drawn from TV series that you know well as The Wire and Homicide: Life on the Street. At the time of Johns Hopkins' formation in 1876, Baltimore was a flourishing industrial city. Decade after decade, it was one of the 10 largest cities in the country, fed by growing rail lines, a thriving port, and a booming market for our city's steel mills. But as the forces of deindustrialization hit, the decline of local factories led to extreme and wrenching job losses. In 1950, Baltimore had more than 1,800 manufacturing firms. By 1990, it had just 844. Rising unemployment was coupled with a middle-class exodus, and neighborhoods that had once been family-friendly bastions were reshaped by significant and concentrated African-American poverty. Today, what was once a city of over 1.1 million people has shrunk to about 620,000, with nearly a quarter of those residents living below the poverty level. Now, this situation was not solely the result of impersonal market forces that inflicted job losses on Baltimore's workforce, but sadly, the logical and direct consequences of a host of government policies and practices that discriminated against African Americans in housing, in education, in policing, and in the workplace. Assessing our situation this spring, The New York Times editorialized that Baltimore's blacks have endured, quote, a century-long assault at the hands of local, state, and federal policymakers, all of whom worked to quarantine black residents in ghettos, making it difficult even for people of means to move into integrated areas that offered better jobs, schools, and lives for their children. The editorial continued that although this happened in cities all over the country, the segregational impulse was particularly virulent and well documented in Baltimore, which is now 63%, and has left, quote, an indelible mark and given that city a singular place in the country's racial history. A very painful set of words indeed. Yesterday, in his introduction to this conference, Stelios Vasilikis commented perceptively on the challenges of making sense of what it means to be a sustainable system or community. He reminded us that we need to be cognizant of whose voices are and are not being heard when defining a sustainability strategy. Though he may not have realized it at the time, he was aptly expressing the challenges that we face in Baltimore today. How do we make sense of the persistence, the seemingly unfathomable tenaciousness of an ecosystem that is so deeply defined by concentrated intergenerational black poverty? And what, in particular, is our role at Johns Hopkins, the largest private institution in the state, one of the country's leading universities and health systems, an institution that receives more federal research dollars than any other in the country and employs over 55,000 people. That's Johns Hopkins today. A little history. The Johns Hopkins University and Hospital were founded through the generous bequest of a Baltimore merchant, Johns Hopkins, in 1876. He had been committed to the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland, and his bequest, though sparsely worded, instructed the institutions to provide scholarships to needy students and medical care to all, regardless of race or income. Johns Hopkins was an abolitionist. In fact, his family had freed slaves, and he was forced to become a merchant as a loss of that livelihood. I'd like to say that we have always lived up to the broad and lofty ideals of our founding in response to local issues. But the truth is, of course, more complicated. From its earliest days, Johns Hopkins provided uncompensated medical care and other supports to our neighbors. But there was, at times, a shortage of trust between the campus and the community. Our research was viewed as lacking sensitivity to our neighbors' needs. Our physical expansion occurred as the city declined, and Baltimore's residents believed we were indifferent to the painful departure of jobs and the influx of drugs and the drug trade. Now, in recent years, we spent considerable time thinking about the ways in which our university can most effectively support our surrounding communities. As a mission-driven institution, we focus on providing education, healthcare, and unparalleled research. We also exercise the traditional roles of a large institution, serving locally as an employer, purchaser, investor, or real estate developer. And recently, we have begun stepping into less traditional roles, such as a convener or agitator. I particularly like the agitator role, if they allow us to leverage the financial, intellectual, and human resources that will improve the quality of life in our city. Through the years, we have built a tapestry of individual and programmatic collaborations across Baltimore, but we recognize that there is more to do. After all, Johns Hopkins is not only in or at Baltimore, but truly and proudly of Baltimore. In the last 6 years, our principal engagement with the city has been through the prism of 2 different placemaking projects that border our 2 Baltimore campuses. One is the East Baltimore Development Initiative, and the other is the Homewood Community Partners Initiative. And I want to talk briefly about both. I want to start in the East Baltimore neighborhoods, which surround our medical campus. In 2000, the median household income of this area was less than half of the city's. And the city's is not so great to begin with. More than 1/3 of households sat below the poverty level, and 7 out of 10 homes sat empty, boarded up, for me, this is still one of the most arresting images of Baltimore as you go around and you see house after house after house boarded up and vacant. And just again, know what a drag that is on the morale of the city. On any of a number of measurements, crime, domestic violence, incidents of child abuse, or lead poisoning, conditions in the East Baltimore neighborhoods were grim. The East Baltimore Development Initiative, or EBDI, started in 2002. It is a $1.8 billion public-private partnership aimed at the revitalization of the 88-acre area that surrounds us. And this wasn't the first effort to revitalize the community, but it was clear that smaller piecemeal efforts had simply not worked. And so if we wanted to make a change, we were going to have to do something much more ambitious. EBDI leveraged the support of local, state, and federal governments, Johns Hopkins philanthropies and businesses to rebuild infrastructure that had fallen fallow and restore the diversity and social strength of the neighborhood. The vision was a sustainable, mixed-income, mixed-use community developed through a mix of physical and human capital development strategies. It included life science research buildings, new housing, a new school, retail development, a hotel, an urban park, and other amenities. There is no overstating the ambitious vision behind EBDI. And of those of you who watched The Wire know, it was basically, it takes place in West Baltimore. The fact is, East Baltimore looks exactly like West Baltimore, and indeed much of the filming of The Wire was actually done in the blocks right around our medical campus. This was not only the largest urban renewal project that Baltimore had ever seen, requiring the acquisition of 2,000 properties and the relocation of 742 households. It is also, to my knowledge, the largest urban redevelopment project in the United States today. Johns Hopkins has consistently supported the project, contributing about $20 million in its first 7 years, but we've recently intensified our commitment, and this is where it's become very interesting. In the last 4 years alone, we spent or committed another $30 million, supporting projects ranging from renovating a local market to improve access of the community to fresh foods, to providing incentives to employees to buy homes in the neighborhood so we could stabilize the community through the purchasing power of our employees, to creating novel partnerships between Hopkins and, in this case, a national pharmacy to lure it into the development precinct. Most important, however, may be the fact that we made major financial investments in, and then in 2012 assumed operating responsibilities for the first new public school built in East Baltimore in more than 2 decades. Henderson Hopkins School is an elementary middle school that serves the children of neighborhood residents, relocated families, and people working within the EBDI district. It has become a force of stability for local families. Significantly, the school benefits from the involvement of almost every part of Johns Hopkins. Music programming by our conservatory, wellness programming by our School of Nursing and School of Public Health, and even sports clinics run by our varsity athletes. Henderson Hopkins is an all-hands-on-deck moment for our university. Now, I don't want to paint EBDI as an unalloyed triumph. It isn't, at least not yet. Progress has taken much longer than it should. Governance of the project is riddled by bureaucratic challenges. Budgets have been exceeded. Budgets have continuously been exceeded. But we've learned to deploy a creative panoply of instruments and strategies, extensive planning, formidable partnerships, and a great investment of financial and political capital, recognizing that if we can get the right pieces in place, we can bring back the vitality that made this community so vibrant years ago. The second community development project that I want to address, our Homewood Community Partnerships Initiative, or HCPI, includes the 10 neighborhoods around our Homewood campus in central Baltimore. Now, this is a stronger community or set of neighborhoods than what surrounds us on the medical school campus. But having said that, despite the strength of these communities and their proximity to us, they still vary very dramatically in the levels of safety, school quality, and housing, presenting a patchwork quilt or patchwork picture within a very small geographic area. Before embarking on this project, we spent more than 6 months engaging with community groups and interested parties from across the footprint. We let the community define what was important to them. And we stood back and let them have the space and the time to think about what they wanted from the community and then from us, rather than us telling them what the community needed. In these conversations, when they ended, we found that on 5 key issues: education, quality of life, housing, commercial and retail development, and local hiring and purchasing, we were more or less on the same page. We were aligned. And the result has been a 95-page report with 29 specific recommendations, a playbook of sorts for all parties. Now, about 2 years ago, Johns Hopkins committed $10 million to the effort, and we've since leveraged about $12 million more, a total that continues to grow. But this is clearly more than a financial investment for us. We have functioned with HCPI and this partnership with our communities as a catalyst for capital improvements, as a supporter of 2 local community schools, as a backer of critical efforts that advance the vision. And we have started to shift the way we make certain real estate decisions, filtering them through the lens of this project. One shining example of this project is our work in Station North, a neighborhood within HCPI that has transformed from a neglected stretch of central Baltimore to a burgeoning arts and entertainment district over the last several years. Now, not long ago, a small group of us approached the Stavros Niarchos Foundation with what seemed like a crazy idea: renovating a century-old Parkway theater which stood at the north end of the project. Now, the Parkway is this majestic venue with sweeping balconies and ornamental ceilings, and between 1915 and its closure in the 1970s, it lured throngs of visitors with movies and live entertainment. But tracking other parts of the city, the neighborhood's fortunes had declined, and despite a few valiant efforts, the theater stood empty, plaster chipping from its walls and ceiling, rodents scurrying around when you go in there to see the site. And we approached the foundation because we knew that it understood the potent force that arts and culture can exert on urban renewal. When it opens in late 2016, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Film Center will become the new home of a dynamic local film festival which hosts films and filmmakers around the world. The building will include 600 seats, 3 screens, and spaces for live performance, and will stand as a centerpiece in the grand vision for Station North District. And across the street, and doing something that is somewhat unprecedented for us, we're moving our undergraduate film program to another renovated theater, creating an artistic hub in what was once a desolate center of the city. This is a few miles from our Homewood campus. And so again, the fact is, we are taking this project so seriously that we're moving our students and faculty into the center of this district so that we can really create synergies for the project. The Foundation's philanthropic contribution to this effort represents a visionary investment that will seed both artistic and economic opportunities for our city. Now, HCPI and EBDI represent just 2 of the ambitious ways in which Johns Hopkins is discharging its role as an anchor institution in Baltimore. But as important and potentially transformative as these projects are, we are increasingly aware that they're not sufficiently responsive to the magnitude, to the urgency of the challenges currently confronting Baltimore. As our city's frailties were so brutally exposed, we have been forced to find new ways not only of acknowledging the palpable pain that plagues our streets, but to address it in meaningful ways. Stated simply, our status quo is neither practically sustainable nor morally acceptable. And whatever initiatives we had previously been mounting under our community engagement rubric, it has become clear to us that we were going to have to do more, do it faster, and do it more intensively. What excites me, especially as an academic with a long-standing interest in policy reform, is the scope that this moment offers for non-trivial reform. We've heard the oft-repeated saying that no one should ever let a crisis go to waste. Implicit in this somewhat glib observation is the understanding that crises allow proponents to upend entrenched and self-serving interest who block change, who resist change, and enable real, desirable, and durable policy reform to happen. That is the perverse magic of a crisis. And so Johns Hopkins is doubling and redoubling our efforts in city building. We're engaging with city, state, and federal leaders in new ways and bringing insistent advocacy to a range of policy issues: health disparities, variances in policing practices and patterns, the woeful performance of our many public schools, and the lack of comprehensive summer jobs program for our high school youth. By the end of the summer, we will formally roll out a comprehensive economic inclusion program that will harness our heft as the region's largest private employer and allow us to support Baltimore workers and local minority-owned or women-owned businesses through clearly defined targets on spending, contracting, and job promotion. We're creating new programs to employ ex-offenders, offering the chance of good jobs and a career path forward after prison. Indeed, last year, we employed more than 120 such returning citizens throughout Johns Hopkins. And we're partnering with nearby schools to create innovative new curricula, opening fields such as mechanical engineering and computer science to our city's youngest students. We're seeing this spring's unrest and the truths that it exposed as a tipping point that will provide us with the opportunity to shed Baltimore's image as a place that embodies our country's most persistent flaws and to instead demonstrate the ways our city can represent the qualities for which the country is most revered and celebrated: can-do optimism, entrepreneurialism, shining idealism, and ingenuity. Earlier this week, on the evening that I flew to Athens, I attended a poignant event in a Catholic church in West Baltimore, just blocks from where the rioting took place. The organizers, a local advocacy group called BUILD, packed 400 people into the pews that evening, a makeshift congregation that included Christians and Jews, blacks and whites, rich and poor, pastors and policymakers. The topics and the testimonials were as diverse as the audience: jobs, safe streets, and youth opportunities. But there was a sense that all of us were in the same conversation, working in concert to change the long-term trajectory of our city. I close with this image, this truly exhilarating moment, because it's not the one that you'll see on the news. But it is fundamental, truly fundamental to our evolving approach to development, one that's collaborative and focused firmly on a shared and sustainable future. And it is just as authentic in describing the essence of our city as the arresting depictions of violence and despair that I mentioned earlier and that dominate media coverage. That night, that event was profoundly and deeply optimistic, focused resolutely on the future we want to bequeath to our children. That future is one that bends the arc of our city towards social justice, decency, dignity, and prosperity. I want to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and particularly its co-president and my dear friend Andreas Dracopoulos for fueling our sense of the possible. Thank you so much for listening to me this morning. Yeah, sure.
We would like to open the floor to the audience for a few questions, please. Raise your hands until the mics can go around.
It's always, I've learned as a law professor, it's always this awkward pause until someone has asked the first question, and then it comes. So there's the first question. Thank you.
Elias Poulias from the Poulias Foundation, Guatemala. Fantastic project, Ron. How do you make it sustainable? How do you project in the future when your brilliant leadership in EBDI, for example, fades away? You go away, who follows? And how does the community, how do you guarantee that the community keeps on going, and they love it, and they do it, and they project in the future?
It's a really great question. And I think, in part, it has been thinking about, EBDI, a lot of people originally saw this as that real estate project. And I said, that's a wrong way to think about it. You're creating a community, and a community is about social, it's about human capital, it's about education, it's jobs, it's culture, it's all these things. And so, in thinking about that, you of course are thinking about all the various partnerships that you can forge so that this is something that the organizations that make for a great community will really embrace this and commit to its longevity. So I think here, in some sense, the project, if it succeeds, although we are very much playing a central role now in trying to fuel the project, make sure that buildings get constructed, houses get developed, and so forth, I'm hoping that what we're going to see is a very gradual shift in responsibility and ownership that will ultimately allow us to feel that the stakeholders now really regard it as theirs and will continue to be committed to its success. So, that's the conversation, and that's the transfer that slowly but surely we're seeking to effect. There was one really interesting part, which I didn't raise in my comments, but when I came to Hopkins, and it was so interesting, you got to imagine, for those of you who've been in East Baltimore, you've got these huge towers that constitute our hospital, health system, and our three schools that are in that part of the city, the medical school, nursing school, and the School of Public Health. And what was so interesting is when I would talk to several folks, both outside of Hopkins and in, everyone seemed to know exactly where Hopkins ended and where the community began. And I thought, well, that is just such a really weird and perverse way of thinking about what is, the community. That is, rather than seeing Hopkins being delineated, and again, it's entirely, it's just, there's a kind of imaginal line that have been defined in people's imagination as to where the two began and ended. And for me, again, the hope is that you're going to have enough connectivity here that in very short order, it's not understood as Hopkins in the community, but it's understood as the community of which Hopkins is a part. And so again, I'm hoping that the trust building that we're working hard at will see this project continue on in that spirit. I see Tony Coles. It's always dangerous when your trustee follows you to Athens to ask a really hard question. But I know he's going to go easy on me because you were on my search committee, Tony, so if I screw this up, you're going to look bad.
Tony Coles, this one will be easy. You talked about the lack of trust between the university and the city when you first arrived. Can you talk about some of the successful examples of how you've helped build that trust with the local leaders, with the community? Because as great an institution as Johns Hopkins is, it is only a part of the fabric of Baltimore. So some of the successful examples of how you've been able to advance the agenda for the city would be great.
So thank you, Tony. I mean, I think, as you know, these stories, particularly when you have an institution as large and as complex as a place like Johns Hopkins, there's not a single narrative. And what's been amazing, I have several colleagues who are here with us in Athens who have or with the Center for Bioethics and the School of Public Health, and so they'll know well of what I speak. But there were just so many parts of the university for decades, if not longer, that were doing lots of things on a one-off basis in terms of forging ties with the community and building trust. On the other hand, we have these other moments when we stumble in various ways in the way in which we did real estate development or some other set of issues that become a galvanizing point for the community. And I think the single most important thing that we've been able to do is to surface within Hopkins, I believe, a sense of the deep connectivity between Hopkins and the city that that I think has given broad scope for people who were doing these partnerships before in a field that they're getting attention, respect, endorsement for what they were doing. And I think that's slowly but surely just changing Hopkins, the way it interacts with the community, and that's been for the good. I will say, we're still learning, and there's still lots to be done. One very quick story that I mentioned to Tony last night. In the wake of the unrest following Freddie Gray, the city was really reeling from what happened. And again, it was in part the protests, but it was in part you're just staring at some of the neighborhoods and just seeing the magnitude of the despair. And what was really interesting was that across the university, in some cases led by deans, in other cases happening quite spontaneously, conversations that had never taken place in the institution between, in the case of the medical school, doctors, PhD researchers, and staff, the janitorial staff, the secretarial staff, who live in these neighborhoods. And all of a sudden you start to realize that as much as we thought we knew each other and understood the community, we didn't. And so, again, I think this is just yet another way in which it takes time and it takes an openness to have these conversations, but ultimately, and again, as an academic, you would expect me to believe this, you have to believe that with an understanding, with a sense of principle, and with an openness to these conversations, that the institution evolves in a way that I think makes it better, and then ultimately, I think, builds that connectivity.
Ron, I want to go back to what Tony Cole said about trust. One of the biggest problems, to my mind at least, is urban flight. That has happened in Baltimore, that happened to Detroit as well, and devastated both cities. And to my mind, the physical manifestation of trust is people returning back into the inner city. Have you seen any of this happening through the efforts of Hopkins?
Yes.
Are people coming back?
Yeah, slowly but surely it's starting to happen. I mean, and this is just so interesting, but what we're finding, which is really one of the most encouraging things. And I always talk about green shoots, that you see little green shoots sprouting all over the city. But one of the things that's most encouraging is that we're now seeing Johns Hopkins recruits its students from across the country and indeed around the world. But what's happened the last couple of years, which was not happening before, is our student body, which a very small percentage is actually from the Baltimore or Maryland region, but the student body that's coming from outside of the region, this is our undergraduate program, on graduation, they're now staying in the city, not necessarily forever, but for 2-3 years afterwards. And I sort of see them as the canaries in the coal mine. If there's a proposition that lures 20-somethings with arts, culture, job opportunities, startup firms, all the things that we know are a critical part of the ecosystem, then I think that's something that ultimately will give us momentum. The reality is that the flight from the city, I think by and large, has happened. So, we're now seeing that the departures have stabilized. We've been a city of about 620,000, going up or down a few hundred, a few thousand a year. But that's sort of held. And so now you really have a sense that we can truly, having hit bottom, now you can start building back up again. And again, things like what we're doing, as you well know, in Station North, I think putting those kinds of propositions on the table it will ultimately feed this regeneration. Yes, you had a question. Did you?
Yes, sir. Have you had any results in approaching some of the firms like Under Armour, who has significantly grown there in the inner city and has started to spread out? And I know that they do a lot of recruiting from Johns Hopkins.
Kevin Plank, who's this young and quite extraordinary leader of Under Armour, and I just were together a few weeks ago, and we're collaborating on a number of different things. I mean, again, this is what's great about Baltimore. And when people say, you have to ask this question, at what point are you fighting to preserve something that a city, a community that no longer has an economic rationale to it? I mean, it can't be the case that every post-industrial city in the United States has to be saved. In some cases, the most intelligent and humane thing to do is to allow people to move. I hope, that's not many places in the United States, but there are clearly some where there's just no longer an economic rationale. I think we feel good about Baltimore because of, obviously, the role that Hopkins plays, but the success of Under Armour and what Kevin Plank has been doing in the city. I mean, that's really the first new, exciting private firm that is not education or health system related to be successful in Baltimore, and to see that become an international brand. And Kevin has a deep sense of commitment to the city. So he really understands the Baltimore proposition and has been a great partner with us.
James Wright, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. You've just talked about the private side of support in a project of this magnitude, and you've talked about the role that Johns Hopkins as a private institution has played and made some comments about the city. That is a special feature, of course, of American planning, where all the different parts sometimes can come together, but even so, state and federal agencies can be either forces for the good or they can be impediments for moving forward. And here in Greece and in Europe, where the state is much more predominant, the ability of nonprofits to move forward works in a very different balance. And I wonder if you would comment about the extent to which you think that in the U.S., the role of academic institutions or of philanthropies is critical for moving the ball forward, or whether or not it's possible for state agencies to actually manage these kinds of projects on their own.
I mean, this has been an important theme that was sounded yesterday, is the value on a number of different fronts, not just financial, but in terms of political strength, of ideas, of a range of different benefits that different players from public, private, and the non-for-profit sector can bring together these projects. I would say, in Baltimore, and again, I can only speak, I'm a Canadian, so I've been in the States for about a decade, and so I've lived in two different cities, Philadelphia and Baltimore, but in both cases, what I guess I'm most struck by is the singular role that philanthropic institutions are playing in a number of these projects that ultimately would be substantially strengthened, much more effective, were there to be more significant federal and state aid for them. So let's go back to Baltimore. Baltimore has this really odd challenge, which is that if you look at the city and the region around it, what you face now is a significant gap between a lot of the employers that are within region, the jobs that they have open, and our ability to get people within Baltimore to those jobs. Now, in part, that reflects a failure of the public school system. We're not doing a good job in the way in which we educate and train students for those opportunities. So that's part of it. But that's not the full story. The principal story, I believe, is one of transportation. I mean, it's remarkable how poorly developed are the public transportation networks between Baltimore and region. And again, it's back to this ugly story of race that seems to define a lot of the narrative in Baltimore. But the city suffers from not having a good east-west connection. The north-south connections, which as it turns out go from the city to the more affluent white suburbs, are actually quite robust. But the east-west connections are terrible. There's 2 projects that are now on the table that have attracted federal commitments of funding, but the state is now ruminating on whether, in fact, with the change in leadership, they're going to go ahead with that project. And, you know, it was so interesting, but again, in the conversations that we had in the wake of the riot, when you started talking to some of the employees that we have at Johns Hopkins, and you just hear, it was amazing to hear what some of our employees have to do to get to work each day. It is a 2-hour trip to go a relatively short distance because of the lack of decent public transit. It's waiting for buses, transferring buses, but waiting and so forth. And again, you know, the crushing weight of that time and the lack of infrastructure is again part of the challenge we face now. So, you know, for me, you know, if cities are, as we believe, you know, the dynamic drivers of the modern economy, I think that we really have to imagine that a federal government that is going to get beyond its gridlock and start to see the ways in which, you know, it can provide a level of investment that is commensurate with the importance of our communities to the national economy. And you're just not seeing that. It's really, really unfortunate. And again, in so many cases, when you look at great projects that have happened in New York and elsewhere, Highline and so forth, it is philanthropy that often is on the cusp of making these things happen. And again, you know, the dream I have is, what if you can have philanthropy and enlightened anchor institutions and state and federal governments that are amplifying the capability, then you really can be firing on all cylinders. Thank you very much.